thank you all for coming. The Columbian is pleased to welcome candidates. It's on.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Pleased to welcome candidates for Clark County Public Utility Commissioner from District 1. I'm Greg Jane, the editorial page editor, and I believe you met the other members of the editorial board. Just so you know, reporter Damian Pasanti is sitting in on this meeting. He won't be asking questions in this forum, but might want to speak with you afterwards. And then we were hoping to videotape this, as we usually do. Instead, we will record the audio, and we will post that unedited on our website for the benefit of our readers. And with that, we will get started. We'll begin with introductions. Just take 1 or 2 minutes to introduce yourselves and explain why you are running for this position. And we'll start at this end of the table.
Great. Well, I'm Judy Chipman, and I have thought about running for this position for a long time. And so I retired from Bonneville Power last year after 16 and a half years there. And I worked in government contracting there. I managed the supply chain contracting for a few years, worked in the realty contracting. And so in that time, I learned a lot about Bonneville Power. And while I didn't have anything to do with power sales, everybody at Bonneville is involved in the rate cases and understanding, what it takes to get the prices down and to keep the prices down. So I have that knowledge. Before that, I worked at the aluminum smelter. And you guys have been around here for a long time, so you recognize Alcoa and Vanalco. So I was a couple years at Alcoa and then the whole time at Vanalco. The last 7 years at Vanalco, I was the director of procurement. So I managed all the warehouse and the purchasing. And during that time that I was director of procurement, of course, is when we could not buy power for a rate at which we could continue to operate. And so I think my perspective on that is really helpful in that I see what happens to a community and to families when those types of jobs are no longer available and the business shuts down. So I think between that, and then I'll talk later about my Columbia Credit Union board experience, but I think I have a pretty unique perspective from both sides, from the user and the seller. So,
Great, thank you. Jim?
Well, I advertise that I'm the committed and qualified candidate. Since I moved back home from California, I've been attending the meetings on a regular basis. I ran twice unsuccessfully against Carol Curtis, losing by 1% the first time and 0.5% the second time. And I was able to win the third time I was running against a non-incumbent. I think I have the educational background. I have a master's degree, or electrical engineering degree from Washington State, a master's in double E from Texas A&M, and a master's in business from Stanford. And I had a 31-year career with Pacific Gas and Electric. And I had an 8-year career teaching at Clark College in a pre-apprenticeship program. So I think I have very strong background in the utility industry. And the PUD is operating in complex energy markets. And I think having at least one board member on the who has that kind of experience is useful to get that utility experience and to be able to ask the right questions of management. So I would like to continue to serve for another 6 years.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sherry Erickson, and I'm interested in being utility commissioner because of the technical nature of the position. Something that you haven't learned about me yet is that my grandfather was actually in the Washington State House of Representatives, so I have a strong commitment to the community and to politics, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be a politician. But when I was introduced to the idea of public utility, how that operates, and what public representation is needed to make it transparent and accountable to the customers, I thought this is a good fit for me. And so I'm putting my hat in, putting my neck on the chopping block, so to say. My background, I have a mechanical engineering degree, and I have an MBA from Washington State University. I'm a licensed consulting engineer, and most of my work experience over the last 22 years has been in design and construction. Worked for PAE Consulting Engineers in Portland, designing mechanical systems for large corporations, big corporate structures. And it was there that I really learned the technicalities of how to build conservation into a building system and why conservation is such an important aspect of design. I also worked for ZGF Architects in Portland, which, as you know, is the premier architecture firm in the world, happens to be headquartered right here in Portland. And I did the business side of the consulting world. I managed the finances of large hospital projects, and it was interesting watching the money side balanced with the creativity side. You know, architects have a vision of what they want, and then I have to come in with the reality of what we have to spend. And so it was a very unique learning experience from a design perspective. Here in Clark County, my husband and I have launched our own small consulting firm, Erickson Structural Consulting Engineers. My husband is the principal engineer there, and I'm the finance side of our business. So I helped launch the business from the start, and it's a very small pie, but I have a very large portion of that pie. So I have a lot of hands-on experience with what it takes to run a business. HR, marketing, web design, hiring, firing, moving into new markets. When the economy dipped, we moved a portion of our firm into the state of Hawaii. So we also have a branch office in Hawaii as well. But it feels really good being connected and deeply rooted in the community, and that's why I want to be Utilities Commissioner. We're going to be here until the day we die. And this position, I think, would be a great way for me to contribute and give back to the community that I love.
Great, thank you. Now, I think one issue involving the utility board is that a lot of people don't understand exactly what it involves, what it does, what kind of skills are needed. So one thing I'm curious about is what role does the commission play in determining where the power comes from and how much we get from each source, and what kind of changes would you make to that? And we'll start with Jim.
Well, the job of the commission is set policy, and the general manager and his staff executes that policy. But they do consult with us about their resource planning objectives. We get something like 60-70% of our power from Bonneville. We have the River Road plant, which has been contributing about 28%, and we buy from the market. We have a small block of wind that, because it can't follow load, we actually sell off because we can't we have the obligation to match load hour to hour, and with wind you really can't do that. So, at any rate, we have a risk committee that meets weekly, and we talk about our power purchase plans. We hedge natural gas prices, contracts out, sometimes 3 or 4 years, to avoid price disruptions in natural gas supply. So, and a commissioner always sets in on those meetings. So, and we have once a year we have a strategy meeting where we go over what the resource plans are going to be for the future. One of my objectives is that we not have any load growth. We've had enough conservation so that even though the county population has grown significantly, we've had no load growth, and that means we don't have to go out and buy new resources that are going to be more expensive than what we have.
No load growth since when? How long has that been?
Oh, it's been at least through my term. It's probably been the last 10 years.
Okay.
And essentially, per capita use of energy has gone down enough to match the population growth.
Why?
Well, because of building standards is one. We have quite a number of conservation programs where we assist customers in conservation and assist businesses. And LED lighting, for example, is one where we get a significant amount of energy conservation from that. We're in the process of replacing all the streetlights in our service area with LEDs. So those kinds of programs are how we've achieved the level of conservation. Now, we're obligated by the state law to achieve a certain amount of conservation, but as a utility, we're really committed to that as a major part of our resource strategy.
Thank you. Judy, do you think, should there be any changes in how we approach the sourcing of electricity?
I don't see any need for any changes. It's pretty well spread out. There's, like he said, there's, our generating plant, there's Bonneville, there's the open market. We get some power from Packwood, from a dam there that we have, I think, 15% from, and then the wind. And so, until something new comes along, I think right now they do a very good job of spreading it out among the five. Yeah.
Sherry, you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. The power supply contracts that they were talking about make up about 65% of the overall electric budget. But an area that I see improving in the future is solar and on-site generation. Wind is too volatile, but solar, especially in the residential application, I think could really it will continue the conservation effort, but I think we're going to see more and more solar in our new construction and in existing large power supply consumers. Every school should have solar panels. Every hospital should have solar panels. All of these, if we have this additional on-site generation, we can continue with conservation because LED light bulbs can only take us so far. We need to tap into some of the power of our natural resources, and I think that will curb the peak growth. There is a big concern with putting solar into the residential market or residential sector, and that is, how do we accommodate for houses that generate more power than they use and put power back into the grid? Does the utility company buy it back? And we had a whole discussion this morning on this at the utility meeting. It's a very complex situation. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be business as usual when you're talking about on-site generation. It is the answer for the future, but it is a more complex equation than having a full requirements contract from the BPA and then distributing it to everybody. So there's some complexities, I think, that will change the power supply in the future.
Judy, what would you advocate in a situation like that, where a household generates more than it uses? Should the utility buy that back?
I think it would be great if the utility can buy it back. Yes, I do, and I think that we are seeing more and more solar, but here in the Northwest, solar's only going to go so far. With our, but I think it would be great if the utility can buy it back, and we did talk about it a little bit this morning, but that's for someone technical to make a decision of how that would happen. But yes, mm-hmm. Yes.
Jim, does that sound feasible?
Well, we do we basically are required by law to provide net metering to 0.5% of our customer load. What we talked about
required by whom?
By the state.
Okay.
By the and there's talk of we voluntarily increased that to 1%. What we talked about this morning is the amount of solar that's come into the county we're approaching that 1% limit, and we deferred the decision till next meeting. But we are going to be talking about, do we want to increase above 1%? What net metering does is basically it provides the customer the equivalent of free 100% efficient storage, because we when they overproduce, we keep track of that, and then we return the energy when the sun's not shining. We don't pay for any on an annual basis. If there's excess generation beyond that, we're not required to pay for that. One of the things we might discuss next time is, do we think it's appropriate to pay for that? I personally don't think so, because we're already giving those customers free energy storage, and to me, that's a sufficient reward. Mm-hmm. And I think our policy is to encourage people that want solar to go ahead. We'll do the best we can accommodate them. I really don't think that we should be building our own solar. I doubt that it's economic, and it's certainly not equivalent to full capacity generation. You really need to have to make solar. One of the things I worry about this carbon initiative is it has a provision in it that requires us to be 100% renewables by some date. That's an impossible goal. It would require a massive investment in storage to take, and I think people need to be realistic. I'm a advocate of carbon reduction. I think it's a good thing, but we've got to be practical in how we try to achieve that goal.
And so that's Initiative 1631, I believe
Yes.
you're referring to. What are your thoughts on 1631?
My thoughts are that I don't believe this particular initiative will solve the problem. I believe fossil fuel usage is a worldwide issue. I also think that Washington State is one of the cleanest, greenest places to live in the world. So do we cripple our economy as an answer to the worldwide problem? No, I don't believe that this would be a solution to the problem. I do believe in investing in conservation, but I don't believe this particular tax that's going to hit transportation a lot harder than it's going to hit the utility, but it's going to hit everyone across the board. But I don't think it's going to create the solutions that we need to solve the problem.
And just, do you believe that climate change is happening and
Yes.
that it is an issue? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Jim and Judy, you would agree?
Yes.
What do you think about 1631?
So I had a meeting this week with Melissa Ankeny, who's stepped in for Rick Dyer and as the finance director on an interim basis. And we were talking about the cost of that to the utility. And the cost of that, what she told me in this next year, I mean, if it was to go through, would be over $9 million a year. And that's a lot of money for not a lot of return for the utility. I mean, there's just like Sherry said, there is very little amount of fossil fuel, just the natural gas plant as far as Clark PUD. And this is one of the cleanest states, and so while it's wonderful to have the conservation and to reduce the carbon, I think it's going a little bit far for what it would cost Clark PUD to be able to do that.
What about, do you think, has the utility effectively adhered to I 937, I believe it was the clean energy initiative passed, about a decade ago or so? How do you think the utility is meeting that goal?
I think the utility probably is very careful, does a very good job in meeting the goals that are there for their.
Should they do more?
Well, I think you can always do more, and I think as time passes and sources change or whatever, that you'd find yourself doing more, just like we did, or doing a lot more now than we were doing 10 years ago. But I think that I'm a very big proponent of hydro energy. I mean, there's, to me, not too much that's more renewable than our water, and I know how much money Bonneville spends on the fish program and trying to alleviate the issues with the fish. And hydro energy is such a renewable source that I think that I would like us to see us continue to keep the hydro energy at the level it is, because it is such a renewable source, and bring the others in as they become available. I know when I was at the smelter, some of the engineers, they were talking about hydrogen, about fuel cells, and all these new things that are coming out. But that was 17 years ago, and that still isn't something that people are regularly using on a basis today. So I think that new things come up, we talk about them, we read about them, people get all excited about them. They don't necessarily work in the marketplace, which I think is what Jim was saying earlier. We have to make sure that it's something that's really reasonable and feasible for us to be able to do that.
Jim, how do you think the utility is?
I think they've done a very careful job to meet the requirements. One of the things we were fortunate is that the legislature established a cost cap so that we don't have to invest in more renewables above an increase of 4% in our cost of power. So that's really protected us from being required to invest more in renewables. I'm really an advocate of us focusing on conservation on our side of the meter and helping customers and those that want to go with renewables on the other side of the meter. And again, one of the provisions of I-937 is that if you have no load growth, you're not obligated to add any renewables. And I think that's good policy.
And that's been the case for you guys.
Well, we did invest in, that was before I came on the board, but they invested in 90 megawatts of wind. Now, we're paying about 10 cents a kilowatt hour for that energy, but because we can't use it, we're selling it for about 2 cents. It's costing the ratepayers of something in the order of $20 million a year for that component. And I think the fact that wind is not a reliable resource, particularly in the Northwest, means that for a utility like ours, it's really not a good solution. And with solar, it benefits us to a certain extent, but if we got a massive amount of solar, then we would have problems with what do we use to back it up with. And
Sherry, how are they doing on 937?
937, they are meeting all the requirements. They do that. They dot every I and cross every T. And they've done that, as you mentioned, through investing in their wind farm, which they spend a tremendous amount of money on, and then they resell it. So I think the intent of the initiative was for our power to be greener, but in essence, we're paying more for the same power supply, if that makes sense. I think that there is potential in wind power. I'm hoping that all of this money invested in this technology will create better storage. I think the problem with wind power is its volatility. It's either really windy or it's not windy at all. And so when you're generating that power, how can you store it? How can you make it more streamlined so that it's a usable energy source? And I'm hoping that I-937 will create opportunities for innovation when it comes to how do we make this renewable energy source more affordable? Because I think that we're making a huge investment in this type of energy. Now let's make it usable. Let's make it affordable. And I know companies like Tesla, they are working on energy storage, and it's very exciting. And I'm hoping that there'll be improvements in this area in the future.
I have a question about power lines. Is that a thing that you guys discuss in the PUD arena?
power transmission lines?
No, just city power lines on the streets.
I'm not sure getting the, no.
So I'm aware of some communities who have specifically started initiatives to underground power
Oh.
lines
Okay.
for just for the sense of place. And
Well, most of the distribution in South County is underground already.
All
in
new-
South County.
Yeah. And
North County, all the new construction. Is that what
all
you're
the
talking
new, all
about?
the new construction
All
is.
the new
Okay.
construction.
And about half of our distribution is already underground.
Good for you. That's great. Good for us.
Well,
Yeah.
it reduces maintenance costs,
Uh-huh.
and if you're talking about new, the cost of undergrounding is not that much greater than overhead for transmission, for distribution.
Yeah.
If you have to replace existing, then you're talking about a big cost hit.
Uh-huh.
So,
Is that have an ROI or philosophically would you support increasing the percentage of lines that are underground? Where do you stand on that, Jim? And I'll go with the
Well,
rest of you.
I certainly like the fact I live out in Amboy, and yet the line that comes in from our road to the transformer that feeds us is underground.
Oh, great.
So I like the fact I don't have poles along the boundary. But I'm not sure I want to ask the rest of the ratepayers in the county to pay for getting rid of the poles along the private road that serves us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it becomes an economic test, and if people want it, they really ought to be willing to pay at least part of the cost. And when I worked at PG&E, we had a policy that 2% of our revenue went into a fund, that neighborhoods could apply for undergrounding. And so some neighbors did that, but a lot of people didn't even want to pay the cost to underground their service lines themselves. And so we found that there weren't that many neighborhoods that, when they really looked at it, decided that it was enough of a problem that they were willing to even pay just for the service line if the utility paid for all the cost of undergrounding the distribution. So it's a great idea. It definitely improves a neighborhood to have underground, but there are cost factors, and I think the people that want it need to be willing to pick up at least part of the cost.
How about you, Judy? What's your thought?
So, when we lived in Hazel Dell, we we lived up on top of the hill on Sylvan Terrace, and whenever there was a storm, our power would go out. And because it was just a small circle, that was the last place that the PUD would get to. So sometimes we'd be out for quite a while. So we moved out to Ridgefield, right, and it's all underground where we are in Taverner Ridge, and I absolutely love it. Then my husband pointed out to me that from the substation to the pole where it goes underground, it's still a line there. It's still covered around trees and all this kind of thing. So he said, we're still at a lot of risk here, and it has gone out once we lived there. But I think as we would maintain and repair and redo lines, might be an opportunity at that time then to underground each one, because I love the underground power. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, the main benefit with underground cable, of course, is reliability, as discussed. There is another downside to underground cable, though, and that's the deterioration of the line under the ground. So when you bury the cable, it's actually there's a higher rate of deterioration because of its position in the ground. So they do, last year they spent over $1 million in doing what's called cable injection. So they go in and they inject the cable line and make it stronger. They extend the life of the cable. So there are costs associated with underground cables as well. So there's a capital investment with taking the poles down, and there's a capital investment with maintaining the underground cable. So you have to, it's an economic equation. But in general, with reliability being a very high priority for the utility, underground cables win, hands down.
Just one.
Even with the, I'm sorry, was it cable injection?
Cable injection.
If
yes.
they do that and they have regular maintenance, what's the lifespan of underground cables?
Jim, the encyclopedia.
Well,
on
I
utilities?
think that it's a fairly new technology, so we're learning. At PG&E, we had to do the similar thing after 20 years of our underground. I think we're learning about better insulation materials so that that's less likely. But we're still it's a long learning curve to make it work. One comment on reliability. One thing the PUD is doing out in our area that improves reliability is we're putting up a lot of tree wire, which is basically insulated overhead conductors. And what that does is if you have a tree limb fall on the line, it doesn't short the line out. And so I live off Amboy Road, and we used to have a lot of outages there because there's lots of trees close to the line. Since they put tree wire up, we've had very few outages. So there are other things you can do to deal with the reliability question.
Now, Wayne Nelson, CEO of the utility, he, at least as of a year ago or so, he was the highest paid public employee in the county. And I don't know if he still is, but he's up there, and the board determines his salary, I believe.
Yes.
What do you tell ratepayers about that? Is he really worth that money? Is he the best public employee in the county?
Well, I think you could make that argument. You could argue that the others are not paid what they should be paid.
Would you make that argument?
I would make that argument. I think if you look in the private sector for jobs for equivalent responsibility in private utilities, they pay a lot more than we pay. We lose general managers to the private utilities because they will pay more for a vice president position than PUD general managers make. So my feeling is that if you've got a general manager like Wayne who's done an excellent job, the ratepayers really benefit from that, and he should get an appropriate salary. I personally feel he's underpaid by a significant amount if you compare him with the private sector.
Judy, any thoughts on that?
So my thoughts would be pretty similar because we go through the same type of an issue on the Columbia Credit Union Board, and we go out and we find out that a lot of credit unions pay a lot more than we do. I think Wayne has done an excellent job, and I think he does have a huge effect on how that utility operates. And so I personally think that he's probably definitely worth it.
Sure.
Yeah, Clark Public Utilities is a $400 million company. That's their annual revenue, and to be a CEO of a $400 million company, I think his pay is reasonable. I think attracting talent to the utility, we are approaching a retirement tidal wave at the utility when it comes to the executive staff. So I think the question is not, is he getting paid enough? The question is going to be, who's going to fill his shoes? Because there's going to be a need for this type of executive leadership. And what salary will that person require? That's a big question mark.
I'm curious. I think, Jim is the incumbent, and from my perspective, Judy and Sherry, you're both well qualified, and you know your stuff, and are very articulate. You're both good candidates, but why should we make a change? Because the utility, by all accounts, it's well run. It's fiscally managed well. I don't think we get a lot of complaints from the public. Why should voters make a change on the board? Let's start with Sherry.
As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, I really feel like the utility company is on the verge of this retirement tidal wave, as I'm calling. So I feel like a presence, a younger commissioner at this time, no offense, Jim, he knows that I support him and admire him. So, but I feel like a younger presence on the board, especially at this time of change, will create managerial continuity. And I believe that maintaining the efficiency of the organization is going to need some staying power. And I intend to run and be in this position for multiple terms. I think there's benefits to that, and that's my intention.
Judy, what do you think about that?
So I think Jim has undoubtedly done a very good job, and that is a very good question because that's what you think of when you decide to run. So in my instance, like I said, I had been planning to run for quite a while. I was told that Jim was not going to run again, and so I was not feeling bad about it. I was feeling very good about it, and then suddenly I find out that he is. But since it's a 6-year term, it's a big decision to wait to run another 6 years, as Jim knows since he did it twice. So I think that I think that what I can bring to this board because of the hiring that's going to go on from my experience at the credit union. So at Columbia Credit Union, I was on the board for 9 years. And 3 of those years, I was the chairman of the board. And during that time is when Columbia lost the CEO. Parker went up to Boeing to be their counsel. And we went out on a job search to hire a new CEO. And we went on a national search. We interviewed many people. And we finally ended up promoting from within. And Steve has done a fabulous job. The credit union was $600 and some million when I went on the board. It was right after the whole naughty, nasty, let's go to a bank if you were here in town at that time. And so I got on the next year, and it was very, very difficult board to be on. But I persevered, got the right people on the board, and during this last few years now, it's gone from $600 and some million to a $1.4 billion credit union. We just got one of the top 25 in the United States Credit Union Awards this last week. It went from 60-some thousand members to 93,000. So I think that what I bring to this is my experience in hiring a CEO and the job search and the things that we went through. And the Columbia Credit Union Board has very much the same responsibilities that Clark PUD commissioners have. Overseeing the CEO, writing policy, making decisions about large purchases, approving some budgets, that kind of thing. And so as I sit in their meetings and watch, it's very, very similar to what I've done on Columbia.
So are you still in the Columbia Editorial
I am
Board?
now on the supervisory committee because you term out after 3
Yeah,
terms.
okay.
So I termed out and I moved to the supervisory committee, so.
Okay.
And actually, with both those answers, you kind of give your final pitch of why people should vote for you. But so I'm curious, though. This is one of our favorite questions. Sherry, if you were not in the race, who would you vote for?
Jim.
Jim, if you were not in the race, who would you vote for?
Sherry.
Okay, Judy.
I'd vote for Jim.
So, Jim, do you have any final thoughts? Give voters your final.
Well,
pitch.
I guess the voters can't do wrong with any of the 3 of us. I think all 3 of us would be excellent commissioners. I do think I bring a perspective and experience that would be beneficial for the next 6 years. But I think the voters are very lucky this time that you have such outstanding candidates.
Sherry, did you have any final thoughts you want to add?
I would be honored to serve in this capacity. My intent here is genuine and wanting to serve the community. Sounds cheesy, but I really want to make this place a great place to live for a long time. And I'm willing to personally invest in that. That's my intent.
Thank you. And Judy, any final thoughts?
Like you said, I think I did cover a lot of it. I think I do bring some fresh energy to this board. I have a lot of energy. I retired in October and had double knee replacement and immediately started thinking about what I could do afterwards. I got very bored. I have a lot of energy and I have a lot of interest in this. And so, like I said, I thought about running for this for a long time. So I do think that I bring a unique skill set with my background in the power users and with Bonneville and the mixture of the Columbia Credit Union Board. So,
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
yeah, thank
Right.
you.